Greetings and welcome to another lecture in psychopathology. This is the second lecture about schizophrenia. In the first, I did an overview and talked about possible genetic issues that were going on in the possible, well, not creation is the wrong word, but the development of schizophrenia. And so what I'm going to talk about here are other issues. The first issue that I'm going to talk about is prenatal exposure, because it does appear that when a developing embryo or fetus is exposed to certain things in the uterus, that it can increase the likelihood of that person developing schizophrenia later in life. The first that was basically determined and the best known is what's called the seasonality effect. And the seasonality effect says that it was a finding that Scandinavian researchers discovered while they were looking through many records of people who later went on to develop schizophrenia. One advantage of state-run healthcare is that they have records for everybody pretty much from the beginning. And they found that people born at certain times of year had a slightly higher chance of developing schizophrenia. And that time of year in Scandinavia was roughly February through May. And they went through all sorts of possible reasons why this would be, and they discovered that this seasonality effect was most prominent in years following a large viral flu epidemic. Now, flu season tends to start around October, and it tends to peter out around February or March. And what's interesting is that if you take that time and you count forward several months, you'll get February through March. It appears to be perhaps through the end of the first semester, beginning of the second, sometimes it's second semester. It has been found, looking more precisely, that if a pregnant woman has the flu during the first trimester of pregnancy, that the resulting baby is 7 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. Now, they're not entirely sure whether it's the flu virus itself, whether it's the virus that might be able to cross the placenta, whether it's antibodies that cross the placenta and cause these changes. Because remember, particularly in the first trimester, the whole pattern of the body is being laid down. In the second trimester, everything gets built, and the third trimester, everything gets bigger and gets reinforced. So if there are problems in the first or in the second trimester, then these problems can wind up to be very devastating. And there's not a whole lot that can be done about them. If you've got a problem with the original blueprint of a house, it doesn't matter how beautifully you build the house, it's likely to still have serious problems. So they're not sure whether it might also be the fever. Because it's been found it's not just the flu, it's also other viruses, and many viruses, one of the first signs that the body is fighting off is a fever. So it may well be that if a woman has a fever in the first or second trimester, that they may well be an ultimate problem with the later baby. Although I will point out that since the general chance of developing schizophrenia is less than 1%. This isn't huge. It's not like if your mom had a fever when she was pregnant with you that you're doomed to have schizophrenia. It's simply that you may have a slightly more likely chance of developing it. This slightly more likely chance is also present in babies that are born to women when there is what's called a rhesus incompatibility. Now, the rhesus factor, or the Rh factor, is a factor that was first basically discovered in rhesus monkeys, which is why it's called the rhesus factor. And it has to do with the blood. Now, if someone is Rh positive, then they do okay with Rh negative blood. If someone is Rh negative, though, they cannot handle Rh positive. They cannot handle that rhesus factor. And there can be some problems when, for instance, a mother is Rh negative and her baby is Rh positive. And it's possible that this could end up in problems with the baby, possibly with hypoxia, a lack of oxygen to that developing fetus before it is born. There also tends to be, other pregnancy and birth complications that cause hypoxia might also cause a slightly larger chance of schizophrenia, whether it's a problem with the umbilical cord, whether it's other problems with a lack of oxygen before birth or during birth, perhaps even more notably. It could definitely be problems. Early nutritional deficiency has been linked with a higher chance of schizophrenia. And unfortunately, a lot of this research came about because of war, specifically World War II. During World War II, a lot of children in Europe who may have survived the war were malnourished because they were not able to get a sufficient amount of food or the right kind of food. And it was found that children that were conceived and born during famine in World War II had twice the likelihood of schizophrenia. Now, whether this is prenatally because the mother was not able to get enough nutrients, enough vitamins, enough proper food, or whether later after the baby was born, either way, it's a problem. Major maternal stress has been linked to a slightly higher chance of schizophrenia. And again, this major maternal stress that occurred during roughly the same time that the seasonality did, late first trimester, early second trimester. So major stress in the woman with higher cortisol, I mean, there's all sorts of things that go on during stress in the body, could quite possibly have affected the development of that embryo or fetus during this very, very important stage of prenatal development. And indeed, this idea of this stress during prenatal development, problems during prenatal development, are a large factor in the next slide, assuming we get to it. The next slide, which is the neurodevelopmental perspective on schizophrenia. The idea here is, you could probably tell by the name, is that there are problems with neurons, problems with the brain, problems with the development of the brain. And the diathesis stress model here is that brain development is somehow disrupted. Whether it's a genetic disruption, as we might have seen from that slide about the relatedness and development of schizophrenia, whether it's congenital, which is something that happens before birth, like exposure to the flu or to fever or malnutrition or whatever, then there does seem to be some sort of disruption that later on stress triggers. Stress brings out the problem. Stress, perhaps the brain cannot adapt to the stress, and so therefore these problems are brought forward and the person is diagnosed with schizophrenia. We also know that the good old major histocompatibility complex that I've talked about before, the MHC, also plays an important role in brain development and the immune system. We talked about it in terms of the immune system, and it also helps, aids in brain development. So not only if there is a lot of similarity in the major histocompatibility complex of people who wind up having a child together, it not only can have a problem with the immune system, it can also wind up having a problem with brain development. And maybe some sort of infection, maybe the flu infection, maybe whatever, maybe a later infection in life is a trigger that brings out a problem with this development or brings out an underlying problem because of this development. We're not sure. Again, a lot of this is correlation. A lot of it is kind of conjecture, but it's the best we have to work with at the moment. Other support for the neurodevelopmental perspective comes from the fact that if you look at the brains of children who go on to develop schizophrenia, even before they have started to develop the symptoms of schizophrenia, you will find differences in those children's behavior. Even before they have been diagnosed, even before they've come down with the normal symptoms, what are considered to be the symptoms of schizophrenia that we talked about in that first video. For instance, children may show unusual hand movements, which I demonstrate for you, but there's no video here. They tend to have fewer positive facial expressions and more negative facial expressions. They're often delayed in speech and motor development. This may be a reflection of that neurodevelopmental problems that happen prenatally that may or may not later go on to express themselves in full-blown schizophrenia or the other psychotic disorders. So there may indeed be an underlying brain issue that is simply brought out by later issues in life, which we'll talk about a little bit later. When we look at the brain abnormalities that are involved in schizophrenia, one thing that is noticed is that when a person is diagnosed, that cognitive problems tend to show up very, very early. The problems with thinking, the abnormalities, the delusions, that sort of thing, they tend to show up pretty early, and they get worse with time. So these may actually show up in some ways before the person is diagnosed, because what is known is that once they are diagnosed with a full-blown illness, there tends to be a sharp decline right before. So it's like everything is going okay for a while, and then all of a sudden something, maybe it's that stressor, maybe it's whatever it is, that comes forward and causes this very, very sharp decline. And it's not only decline in what we tend to think of, the confusion and the delusions and whatnot, it's also decline in things like reaction time. Reaction time is slower. Working memory is smaller. There's problems with tracking things with the eyes. You might have seen this when people are tested for alcohol intoxication, because one of the first things that show us up with alcohol intoxication is problems tracking. Same thing happens with schizophrenia. Problems with habituation. They can't get used to things, or maybe they get used to things too quickly. So these are things that show up early that are problems, and that definitely get worse once the person has been diagnosed. In addition, there are problems with social cognition. People have problems recognizing social hints, recognizing facial expressions, not recognizing when they make an error. Most people are pretty good at this. The people that aren't pretty good at it, for instance, include children with autism. And we'll talk about autism later, but sneak preview, autism also appears to be very much a problem with the brain, as is schizophrenia. So it would make sense that both of these disorders would show problems with social cognitions, with recognizing these social hints or emotions or whatnot, that people with normal functioning brains have no problems with. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things that might be going on in the next video.